A woman stood at the edge of the railroad tracks, her silhouette trembling against the pale dawn sky. In her arms, a bundle wrapped in torn calico shifted once, then went still. She knelt, placed it carefully between the iron rails, and vanished into the prairie grass. Moments later, a distant whistle cut through the silence. A train was coming. By the time cowboy Ethan Cole saw the bundle and heard that whistle growing louder, he had seconds to decide: ride on, or risk everything for a life the world had already thrown away. If you want to see how far a single choice can travel, stay with me until the end of this story. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Mara's story reaches across this world. The Colorado dawn broke cold and colorless, the kind of morning that made a man feel small beneath the weight of an endless sky. Ethan Cole had been riding since midnight, his wagon creaking under the load of fence posts and tools he'd hauled from Denver. The railroad tracks ran parallel to the trail, two strips of iron cutting through the high desert like scars on old leather. He'd followed them for miles, grateful for the company of something man-made in all that emptiness. But when the sun finally crested the eastern ridgeline, spilling thin gold across the sage and stone, Ethan saw something that didn't belong. A shape. Small and dark, resting between the rails about 50 yards ahead. He pulled the reins without thinking, and the mare stopped, snorting fog into the brittle air. Ethan squinted. At first he thought it was a sack of grain, maybe fallen from a passing freight car. But as the light strengthened, he saw the edges of fabric, pale, almost white, and the unmistakable curve of something wrapped inside. His gut tightened. He set the brake, climbed down slowly, boots crunching on the gravel ballast. The air smelled like dust and creosote. Somewhere far off, a hawk screamed. Ethan approached the bundle with the caution of a man who'd seen too much to trust what his eyes told him. When he was close enough to crouch, he saw it clearly. A baby. Swaddled in a threadbare calico quilt, the child lay motionless on the rail ties, her tiny face barely visible beneath the folds of cloth. Her skin was pale, lips faintly blue. For one horrible moment, Ethan thought she was already gone. Then her chest rose. Shallow, fragile, but real. She was alive. Ethan's hands hovered over her, uncertain. He wasn't a man who handled delicate things. His palms were scarred from rope burns and split knuckles, his fingers thick and clumsy. But the baby's eyes fluttered open, dark, unfocused, and something in him cracked wide. He lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest. She was so light it scared him. Her head lolled against his forearm, and he adjusted his grip, trying to remember if there was a right way to hold an infant. The quilt fell loose, and a scrap of paper tumbled out, landing face up on the railroad tie. Ethan stared at it. One word, scrawled in unsteady handwriting: unwanted. The air left his lungs. He looked down at the child in his arms, then back at the note, then at the tracks stretching east and west into nothingness. Whoever had left her here had wanted her found, or wanted her dead. It didn't matter which. What mattered was the faint whistle he could hear now, rising on the wind. A train, coming fast. Ethan didn't think. He turned and ran. His boots skidded on loose gravel as he carried the baby back to the wagon, clutching her tight against his chest. The whistle grew louder, sharper, and he could feel the vibration in the rails now, a low hum that crawled up through the earth and into his bones. He reached the wagon, pulled himself up one-handed, and whipped the reins hard. Go! The mare bolted forward, hooves pounding. Ethan glanced back just in time to see the locomotive round the bend, its black body cutting through the morning haze like a blade. The engineer must have seen something, maybe the quilt, maybe Ethan himself, because the whistle screamed again, long and desperate. Brakes shrieked. Sparks flew from the wheels. But Ethan was already gone. The wagon rattling down the trail toward Silver Hollow, the baby pressed against his chest, still breathing. Silver Hollow wasn't much of a town. A main street of packed dirt, a general store, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, and a small white schoolhouse perched on the edge of the settlement like an afterthought. Ethan had passed through once before, months ago, to pick up supplies. He remembered it as the kind of place where people minded their own business, which suited him fine. But now, with a half-frozen infant in his arms and no idea what to do with her, he needed help. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and climbed down, still holding the baby. She hadn't cried once. That worried him more than if she'd been screaming. Inside the store, a barrel-chested man with a white beard looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to outright alarm. "Good Lord, Cole. What have you got there?" "Found her on the tracks," Ethan said, his voice rough. "She needs a doctor." "We don't have one. Nearest Sawbones is in Leadville, 2 days' ride." The man came around the counter, peering at the baby. "She breathing?" "Barely." "Then you best get her warm. Schoolteacher might know something, Miss Hart. She's got some nursing experience, I hear." Ethan nodded and turned without another word, heading back into the cold. The schoolhouse was a short walk, but every step felt like a mile. The baby's breathing had grown even shallower, her skin colder to the touch. He pushed through the schoolhouse door without knocking. Inside, a woman stood at the blackboard, chalk in hand, mid-sentence. She turned sharply at the intrusion, her expression ready to scold, until she saw what he was carrying. "Jesus and Mary," she breathed, and crossed the small room in 3 strides. Lydia Hart was not a beautiful woman in the way men usually spoke of beauty. She was tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from something practical, stone, maybe, or good oak. But her hands, when she reached for the baby, were gentle and sure. "How long has she been out in the cold?" she asked, already unwrapping the quilt. "I don't know. Found her maybe 20 minutes ago." Lydia's jaw tightened as she examined the infant. "She's hypothermic. We need to warm her slowly. Too fast and we'll shock her system." She looked up at Ethan, her gray eyes sharp and assessing. "Can you start a fire in the stove and fetch water from the pump out back? Clean water." Ethan moved. He'd been given orders before, by foremen, by trail bosses, but there was something different in Lydia's tone. Not command exactly. Certainty. Like she knew what needed doing and trusted him to do it. He got the stove roaring and hauled in a bucket of water while Lydia worked. She stripped the baby carefully, checking for injuries, then wrapped her in a dry wool blanket from a cedar chest in the corner. The infant's breathing stuttered, then steadied. Color began to seep back into her cheeks. "She'll live," Lydia said quietly, more to herself than to Ethan. "But she's not out of danger yet." Ethan stood by the stove watching. The baby's eyes were open now, staring up at Lydia with that unfocused intensity newborns have, like they're looking at something just beyond the visible world. Lydia dipped a clean cloth in warm water and dabbed at the baby's lips, coaxing her to take a little moisture. "You found her on the tracks?" Lydia asked without looking up. "Between the rails." There was a note. Ethan pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Lydia read it, her expression hardening. She set the note aside and returned her attention to the baby. Someone wanted her gone, or wanted it to look like an accident. "Does it matter?" Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure it did. Lydia worked in silence for a while, warming the baby gradually, checking her breathing, whispering soft reassurances that seemed to calm the infant, even though she couldn't possibly understand the words. Ethan watched, feeling useless and out of place in the tidy schoolroom with its rows of empty desks and chalk-dusty air. Finally, Lydia looked up at him. "What do you plan to do with her?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Thought maybe the sheriff..." "Sheriff Preston's out of town for another week. Circuit court up in Boulder." She paused, weighing something. "Until he gets back, someone's going to have to care for her. She needs to be fed every few hours, kept warm, watched." Ethan's throat tightened. "I can't. I'm not asking you to." Lydia's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "I'm telling you what the situation is. This baby needs help, and right now, we're all she's got." The word we hung in the air between them. Ethan looked at the infant, so small and still in Lydia's arms. He thought about the note, about the train whistle, about the choice someone had made to leave this child to die. And he thought about himself, about the orphan train that had carried him west when he was 7, about the foster homes that had used him like a work animal, about the day he'd finally run and never looked back. "I'll pay for whatever she needs," he said, his voice low. "Food, clothes, whatever, but I can't." "I know." Lydia said, and there was no judgment in her tone, just understanding. I'll keep her here tonight. You can come by in the morning, and we'll figure out what comes next. Ethan nodded. He should have left then, should have walked out and let Lydia handle it. But his feet didn't move. He stood there, staring at the baby, at the way her tiny fingers curled and uncurled against the blanket. Does she have a name? Lydia asked. No. Lydia looked down at the infant, thoughtful. We should call her something, even if it's temporary. You pick, Ethan said. Lydia considered for a moment, then nodded. Mara. It means bitter in Hebrew, but also of the sea, something that endures. She glanced up at Ethan. Does that suit her? Ethan looked at the baby, at Mara, and felt that crack in his chest widen. Yeah, he said quietly. It suits her. He left the schoolhouse as the sun was setting, the sky bruising purple and gold over the mountains. The air had turned sharp, the kind of cold that came down from the high country and settled in a man's bones. Ethan walked back to his wagon, climbed up, and sat there for a long time, reins slack in his hands. He should have been relieved. He'd done the right thing, hadn't he? Found the baby, got her help, made sure she'd be cared for. Now it was someone else's problem. But the image of that note wouldn't leave him. Unwanted. Ethan had been unwanted once. He knew what it felt like. The hollow certainty that you were a burden, a mistake, something to be rid of. He'd carried that knowledge his whole life. Let it shape him into someone who didn't need anybody, who didn't let himself be needed. And now here was this baby, marked with the same word he'd spent 30 years trying to outrun. He didn't sleep that night. He made camp just outside town, built a fire, and sat watching the flames until they burned down to embers. When dawn came, gray and cold, he saddled his mare and rode back into Silver Hollow. Lydia was already awake, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with Mara bundled in her arms. She looked tired, her hair slightly mussed, but the baby looked better, alert, responsive, her cheeks pink with life. She made it through the night, Lydia said as Ethan approached. I think she's going to be all right. Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. That's good. I sent word to the county clerk, Lydia continued. They'll start looking for the mother, though I doubt they'll find her. In the meantime, Mara needs a temporary guardian, someone the law can hold responsible until the sheriff sorts this out. Ethan's stomach nodded. And you're thinking that should be me? You're the one who found her. That doesn't make me responsible for her. Lydia's gray eyes were steady, unflinching. Then who is? Ethan looked away, jaw tight. The question scraped against something raw inside him, something he'd buried years ago and never wanted to dig up again. He thought about riding away, about leaving Silver Hollow and Mara and Lydia Hart behind. He could do it. Nothing was stopping him, except the memory of that note, except the sound of the train whistle, except the way Mara's fingers had curled around his thumb when he'd first lifted her from the tracks. I don't know how to take care of a baby, he said, his voice rough. I'll help you, Lydia said simply. Ethan looked at her, startled. Why? Because she needs help. And so do you. The honesty of it staggered him. He wasn't used to people seeing through him so clearly, wasn't used to being offered help without strings attached. For a long moment, he didn't know what to say. Finally, he nodded. All right, but just until the sheriff gets back. Oh, just until then, Lydia agreed, though something in her expression suggested she didn't quite believe him. Well, the first week was chaos. Ethan's homestead was a rough-built cabin 10 miles outside Silver Hollow, perched on a windswept hillside with nothing but sagebrush and sky for company. It was no place for a baby. Lydia made that clear the first time she visited, standing in the doorway with Mara in her arms, surveying the single room with its dirt floor, cold stove, and unmade cot. This won't do, she said flatly. It's what I've got, Ethan replied, defensive. Then we'll make it work. She handed Mara to him, carefully, like she was passing him something fragile and explosive, and set to work. Over the next few days, Lydia transformed the cabin. She scrubbed the floor, hung canvas over the windows to block the drafts, and rigged a makeshift cradle from an old apple crate and some soft blankets. She taught Ethan how to heat milk just enough to take the chill off, how to hold Mara so her head didn't loll, how to change a diaper without fumbling through it like he was defusing a bomb. "You're doing fine," Lydia said one afternoon, watching him feed Mara with a bottle made from a whiskey flask and a scrap of rubber tubing. "Better than most men would." "That's not saying much," Ethan muttered. Lydia smiled, a rare, fleeting thing. "No, I suppose it's not." Mara cried at night, long, wailing cries that echoed through the cabin and set Ethan's teeth on edge. He'd never felt so helpless in his life. He tried everything, rocking her, singing to her in a voice that sounded like gravel, even pacing the floor with her pressed against his chest until his legs ached. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. One night, near the end of that first week, Mara wouldn't stop crying. Ethan walked the floor for hours, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold, his nerves frayed to nothing. He was about to saddle up and ride into town, wake Lydia, beg her to take over, when the door opened. Lydia stood in the threshold, wrapped in a wool coat, a lantern in her hand. "I heard her from the road," she said quietly. Ethan stared at her, too exhausted to feel embarrassed. "I don't know what's wrong." "Give her to me." He passed Mara over, and Lydia settled into the rocking chair by the stove. She held the baby close, humming something low and tuneless, and within minutes Mara's cries softened, then stopped. Ethan watched, dumbfounded. "How did you—" "She just needed to know someone was listening," Lydia said, glancing up at him. "Babies can tell when you're afraid. It makes them afraid too." Ethan sank onto the edge of his cot, scrubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if I can do this." "You're already doing it," Lydia said. "You just don't trust yourself yet." "Why are you helping me?" he asked, the question coming out rawer than he'd intended. "You don't owe me anything." Lydia rocked slowly, her gaze on Mara's sleeping face. "Because I know what it's like to be told you're not enough. And I know what it's like to prove them wrong." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. There was something in her expression, a kind of quiet defiance, that reminded him of himself, like she'd been tested by fire and come through harder and sharper on the other side. "What happened to you?" he asked. Lydia didn't answer right away. She just kept rocking, kept humming, her hands gentle on Mara's back. Finally, she said, "That's a story for another night." And Ethan, somehow, understood that was enough. By the end of the second week, a rhythm had formed. Lydia came by every evening after school, staying late into the night to help with feedings and diaper changes. Ethan learned to anticipate Mara's needs, when she was hungry, when she was tired, when she just needed to be held. He stopped fumbling and started trusting his instincts, the way Lydia had told him to. The people of Silver Hollow noticed, of course. Small towns thrived on gossip, and the sight of the reclusive cowboy and the stern schoolteacher raising an abandoned baby together was too rich a story to ignore. Ethan heard the whispers when he came into town for supplies, saw the sidelong glances, the raised eyebrows. He didn't care. One afternoon, he found Lydia in the schoolhouse after hours, grading papers by lamplight. Mara was asleep in the cradle, and the room smelled like chalk dust and wood smoke. "Sheriff's due back tomorrow," Ethan said from the doorway. Lydia looked up, her expression unreadable. "I know." "He'll want to take her, find her a family." "Yes." Ethan stepped inside, his hat in his hands. "What if I said I didn't want that?" Lydia set down her pen carefully. "Then I'd ask you what you do want." Ethan looked at Mara, at her tiny chest rising and falling in sleep. He thought about the note, about the train, about the way she'd gripped his thumb that first morning, and he thought about the word unwanted and how much power it had held over him for so long. "I want to keep her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to give her a home." Lydia stood slowly, crossing to where he stood. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with those gray eyes that saw too much. "Do you understand what you're asking?" she said quietly. "She's not a stray calf you found on the range. She's a person. She'll need you for years, decades. She'll need patience and love and stability. Can you give her that?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I want to try." Lydia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then we'll tell the sheriff together." "We?" Lydia smiled, small, wry, but real. You didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you? And in that moment, Ethan realized something that should have scared him, but didn't. He wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without meaning to, he'd built something fragile and unexpected. A partnership, maybe. Or the beginning of one. And standing there in the lamplight, with Mara sleeping and Lydia beside him, Ethan felt the crack in his chest widen into something that almost felt like hope. The next morning, Sheriff Preston returned to Silver Hollow. He was a grizzled man in his 50s with a handlebar mustache and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much cruelty to be surprised by it anymore. He listened to Ethan's story in his small office, nodding occasionally, his expression giving nothing away. When Ethan finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I'll be straight with you, Cole. The law says an abandoned child becomes a ward of the county. Normally, she'd go to an orphanage, probably one of the church homes in Denver. They'd try to place her with a family eventually, but it could take months, maybe years." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What if I want to adopt her?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You? A single man with no wife, living in a one-room cabin 10 miles from town?" "I've got help," Ethan said, glancing at Lydia, who sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "Miss Hart's been assisting with Mara's care." The sheriff looked at Lydia, then back at Ethan, and something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or suspicion. "That's so?" "It is," Lydia said calmly, "and I intend to continue." The sheriff drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking, "I don't suppose you two are planning to make this arrangement official?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's face went hot. We're not. That's not what this is about," Lydia cut in, her voice steady. "Mr. Cole wants to provide a home for Mara. I'm helping him do that. What happens beyond that is nobody's business but ours." The sheriff held up a hand. "Easy, Miss Hart. I'm not trying to insult anybody. I'm just laying out the facts. A single man adopting a baby? That's going to raise questions. But a married couple?" He shrugged. "That's a different story." Ethan and Lydia exchanged a glance. Neither of them spoke. The sheriff sighed again. "Look, I'll be honest with you. I don't like the idea of sending that baby to an orphanage any more than you do. I've seen what happens to kids in those places, especially girls. So if you're serious about this, Cole, I'm willing to work with you, but you need to understand the county's going to want proof that you can provide a stable home. That means income, shelter, and someone to care for the child when you're working. Can you do that?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "Then I'll file the paperwork, but it'll take time, months probably. Until then, Mara stays with you, but officially, she's still a ward of the county. If I get even a whiff that she's not being cared for properly, I'll pull her out of there faster than you can blink. Understood?" "Understood." The sheriff stood, extending his hand. Ethan shook it, feeling the weight of what he'd just agreed to settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. As they left the sheriff's office, Lydia walked beside him in silence. When they reached the schoolhouse, she stopped and turned to face him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "No," Ethan said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Lydia smiled, small, sad, hopeful. "Then I suppose we'd better get to work." And together they walked back into the schoolhouse, where Mara was waiting. The weeks that followed moved like water over stone, slowly reshaping everything they touched. Ethan's cabin, once a bachelor's refuge of unwashed dishes and scattered tools, transformed into something that almost resembled a home. Lydia brought curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, their pale fabric softening the harsh angles of the rough-cut windows. She hung dried herbs from the rafters, sage and lavender, that made the air smell clean instead of just empty. A wooden high chair appeared one morning, built by the blacksmith in town who'd heard about their situation and wanted to help. Small kindnesses like that kept coming, unexpected and quietly offered, as if the whole town had decided to hold its breath and see if this strange arrangement might actually work. Mara grew. Not quickly, babies never did, but steadily, her body filling out with the kind of health that came from regular feeding and warm sleep. Her eyes, which had been unfocused and dark in those first terrible hours, sharpened into something alert and curious. She tracked movement now, followed Ethan's face when he leaned over her cradle, reached for Lydia's fingers when they brushed her cheek. The doctor from Leadville finally made it out to examine her, a stern-faced woman named Dr. Calloway, who poked and prodded and listened with her stethoscope before pronouncing Mara remarkably resilient for a child who should have died. "You did well," Dr. Calloway told them both, snapping her medical bag shut. "Not many men would have stopped. Fewer still would have kept her." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. But later, alone in the cabin with Mara sleeping in her cradle, he thought about those words. Not many men would have stopped. He wondered what that said about the world, that mercy was noteworthy instead of expected. He wondered what it said about him, that he'd almost ridden past. Lydia came by every evening after school let out, the 2-mile walk from town becoming as routine as breathing. She never complained about the distance, never mentioned the cold or the wind or the way the trail turned to mud when it rained. She just arrived, hung her coat on the peg by the door, and picked up whatever needed doing. Sometimes that meant feeding Mara, while Ethan fixed supper. Sometimes it meant mending clothes by lamplight while he rocked the baby to sleep. They didn't talk much during those hours, didn't need to. The work created its own language, a rhythm of shared purpose that felt more honest than words. But one night, nearly a month after the sheriff's visit, Lydia broke the silence. "Tell me about the orphan train," she said. Ethan looked up from the pot of stew he'd been stirring. Lydia sat in the rocking chair with Mara drowsing against her shoulder, her expression calm but expectant. He'd mentioned it once, weeks ago, in passing. He hadn't expected her to remember. "Why do you want to know?" "Because it matters," Lydia said simply. "Because you found Mara on those tracks for a reason, and I think that reason has something to do with wherever you came from." Ethan set down the wooden spoon and crossed to the window, staring out at the darkening hills. The memory sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy. He'd spent years trying not to think about it, trying to bury it under work and distance and deliberate solitude. But Lydia was right. It mattered. And maybe it was time to let it see daylight. "I was 7, he said quietly. "My mother died of cholera in St. Louis. I don't remember my father. Don't even know if I had one. The church put me on a train heading west with about 40 other kids. Orphans, runaways, children whose parents couldn't feed them anymore. They lined us up at every stop, let families look us over like livestock. Some kids got picked, most didn't." "And you?" "Ended up with a farmer outside Omaha. He needed help with his wheat fields. Didn't care much about anything else." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I worked that farm for 6 years, slept in the barn, ate scraps, got beaten when I didn't move fast enough. When I was 13, I ran, stole a horse, and kept riding until I hit Colorado." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow circles on Mara's back. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Don't be. I survived." "Surviving isn't the same as living." Ethan turned to look at her, caught off guard by the gentleness in her voice. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting. "You never talk about where you came from." Lydia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's because where I came from doesn't want to claim me anymore." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I was engaged once, back in Boston, before I came west. His name was Charles, a banker's son, very respectable. We were supposed to marry in the spring." Her voice was steady, almost clinical. 2 months before the wedding, I found out he'd been keeping a mistress. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it, said it was normal for men of his station, said I should be grateful he was still willing to marry me. Ethan felt anger flare in his chest. "What did you do?" "I broke the engagement, publicly, at a dinner party his parents were hosting." Lydia's smile turned sharp. "His family was humiliated. My family was furious. They gave me a choice: apologize to Charles and beg him to take me back, or leave Boston and never speak to them again." "So you left?" "So I left." She looked down at Mara, her expression softening. "I took my teacher's certification and headed west. Figured if I was going to be unwanted, I might as well be unwanted somewhere with decent scenery." Ethan crossed back to the stove, ladling stew into 2 bowls. He handed one to Lydia, careful not to jostle Mara, and sat down across from her with his own. They ate in silence for a while. The only sounds, the crackling of the fire, and Mara's soft breathing. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Lydia said eventually, a hint of wry humor in her voice. "The runaway orphan and the disgraced spinster." "Don't forget the unwanted baby," Ethan added. Lydia looked at Mara, her expression tender. "She's not unwanted. Not anymore." And Ethan, watching the two of them together in the lamplight, felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. It felt like the first thaw after a long winter, like ice cracking and water beginning to flow again. 2 days later, the first real test came. Ethan was out mending fence line when he heard the horse approaching. He straightened, shading his eyes against the midday sun, and recognized the rider immediately, Samuel Brennan, owner of the largest ranch in the valley. Brennan was a hard man, the kind who measured worth in acres and cattle and didn't have much patience for anything that didn't turn a profit. He reined up his bay gelding and dismounted with the stiff movements of someone who'd spent too many years in the saddle. "Cole," he said by way of greeting. "Brennan." Ethan kept his voice neutral. "Something I can do for you?" "Heard you're trying to adopt that baby you found. That true?" Word traveled fast in small towns. Ethan nodded. "It is." Brennan spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "That's a fool's errand. You got no wife, no steady income beyond what you can scratch out of this hard-scrabble piece of land. County's going to take one look at your situation and put that baby in an orphanage where she belongs." "She belongs here," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "Says who? You?" Brennan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're a drifter, Cole. Always have been. What makes you think you can raise a child?" Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "I'm doing the best I can. Best isn't good enough. That baby needs a real family. People with resources, stability. I've got a sister in Denver. She and her husband have been trying for years to have children. They'd take the baby in a heartbeat, give her a proper home, proper schooling, proper opportunities." "She has a home," Ethan said. "Here, with me." Brennan shook his head. "You're being selfish, Cole. You're holding on to that baby because it makes you feel like you're worth something. But what's best for her isn't about what you need. It's about what she deserves. And she deserves better than a one-room cabin and a man who doesn't know the first thing about being a father." The words hit like fists, precise and brutal. Ethan felt his chest tighten, felt the old, familiar shame rising up. The voice that had always told him he wasn't enough, would never be enough. Brennan saw it too, saw the flicker of doubt, and pressed his advantage. "Think about it, Cole. Do the right thing. Let my sister take the baby. She'll have a good life in Denver. You can go back to whatever you were doing before all this started." Brennan mounted his horse and rode off without waiting for a response, leaving Ethan standing alone in the middle of his half-mended fence line, the taste of failure sharp on his tongue. That evening, Lydia found him sitting on the porch steps, staring out at nothing. Mara was asleep inside, and the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash. Lydia sat down beside him without speaking, her shoulder just touching his. "Brennan came by today," Ethan said finally. "I heard. He thinks I should give Mara up. Says she'd be better off with his sister in Denver." Lydia didn't answer right away. She just sat there, her gaze on the horizon, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Do you believe that?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I am being selfish. What do I have to offer her? This place barely keeps me fed, let alone a baby. And I don't know anything about raising a girl. What happens when she gets older, when she starts asking questions I can't answer? What happens when she needs things I can't give her? What happens if she grows up in Denver with people who have money and resources but don't love her?" Lydia countered. "What happens if she spends her whole life wondering why the man who found her didn't want her enough to keep her?" Ethan looked at her, startled. "You think she won't remember this?" Lydia continued. "Maybe not consciously, not now, but children carry their beginnings with them. They know when they're wanted. And Mara, she knows you. She trusts you. You're the first person who didn't give up on her. What if that's not enough? Then we'll make it enough." Lydia's voice was steady, certain. "Listen to me, Ethan. I've taught children for 8 years. I've seen rich kids and poor kids, kids with 2 parents and kids with none. And you know what matters most? Not money, not a big house or fancy clothes. It's knowing that someone will fight for you, that someone believes you're worth the trouble. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, the knot of doubt unraveling just slightly. You really think I can do this? I know you can, because you're already doing it. Lydia stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Now come inside. Mara will be waking up soon, and I made extra stew. You look like you haven't eaten all day. She was right. He hadn't. Inside, the cabin was warm and bright, the stove radiating heat and the smell of Lydia's cooking filling the air. Mara stirred in her cradle, making the small, snuffling sounds that meant she'd be awake and hungry soon. Ethan picked her up carefully, cradling her against his chest the way Lydia had taught him, and felt her settle immediately, her tiny hand fisting in his shirt. There you are, he murmured, and Mara's eyes opened, dark and clear, looking up at him with something that might have been recognition, or trust, or both. Lydia set a bowl of stew on the table and watched them, her expression unreadable. She knows you're her father, she said quietly, even if the law doesn't say so yet. Ethan looked up at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. You think so? I know so. And in that moment, sitting in the warm cabin with Mara in his arms and Lydia across from him, Ethan made a decision. He didn't care what Brennan thought, or what the county officials might say, or what doubts still lingered in the back of his mind. This was his daughter, and he was going to keep her. The winter came early that year, sweeping down from the high country with teeth of ice and wind. The cabin, despite Lydia's improvements, wasn't built for serious cold. Drafts crept through gaps in the walls, frost formed on the inside of the windows, and the stove had to be fed constantly just to keep the temperature above freezing. Ethan worked himself ragged chopping firewood, hauling water from the creek before it iced over, insulating the walls with layers of canvas and old newspapers. Lydia helped when she could, but the schoolhouse demanded her presence during the day, and the walk back and forth in the snow became treacherous. One night, a blizzard hit so hard the world disappeared into white. Lydia had stayed late, helping Ethan weatherproof the cabin, and by the time they noticed the storm building, it was too dangerous for her to leave. The wind howled like something alive, shaking the cabin walls and sending snow sideways through the air in blinding sheets. Ethan stood at the window, watching the trail vanish beneath the drifts, and felt his stomach knot. You'll have to stay, he said, turning to Lydia. Can't risk you trying to get back in this. Lydia nodded, no argument in her expression. I expected as much. They made the best of it. Ethan gave Lydia his cot and made himself a pallet on the floor near the stove. Mara slept in her cradle between them, oblivious to the storm raging outside. The cabin creaked and groaned under the wind's assault, but the walls held, and the fire kept burning. Sometime past midnight, Ethan woke to the sound of Mara crying. Not the usual hungry cry, but something sharper, more distressed. He sat up immediately, his heart pounding. Lydia was already awake, kneeling beside the cradle with a lamp in her hand. She's burning up, Lydia said, her voice tight with worry. Ethan crossed to them in 2 strides, pressing his hand to Mara's forehead. Heat radiated from her skin, and her face was flushed and damp with sweat. Her cries were weak, almost breathless. What do we do? Ethan asked, fear clawing at his throat. We need to cool her down. Get me a basin of water, lukewarm, not cold, and find clean cloths. Ethan moved fast, his hands shaking as he poured water from the kettle into a basin and grabbed every clean cloth he could find. Lydia worked with calm efficiency, stripping Mara down to her diaper and sponging her with the warm water, whispering soothing words that Ethan couldn't make out over the pounding of his own heart. Will she be all right? He asked, hating how helpless he sounded. I don't know, Lydia admitted. Fevers in babies can turn dangerous fast. We need to keep her temperature down and hope it breaks before morning. They worked through the night, taking turns sponging Mara, holding her when she cried, checking her temperature with anxious hands. The storm raged on, trapping them inside with their fear and their prayers. Ethan had never felt so powerless. All the strength in his body, all the survival skills he'd learned in 30 years of hard living, none of it mattered. He couldn't fight a fever with his fists or outride it on horseback. All he could do was sit beside the cradle and watch his daughter struggle to breathe. This is what Brennan was talking about, he said hoarsely, sometime near dawn. I can't even get her to a doctor. What kind of father is that? The kind who's doing everything he can with what he has, Lydia said firmly. Stop torturing yourself, Ethan. Babies get sick. It happens to rich families and poor families alike. The storm isn't your fault, and neither is this fever. But if we were in town, we'd still be doing exactly this. Waiting, hoping, praying if you're the praying type. She looked at him, her gray eyes steady despite the fear he could see lurking behind them. Mara's strong. She survived being left on those tracks. She'll survive this too. Ethan wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. So he nodded and went back to work, sponging Mara's forehead, whispering to her the way Lydia did, telling her she had to hold on, that he wasn't ready to lose her. Just before sunrise, the fever broke. Mara's skin cooled beneath Ethan's hand, her breathing eased, and the terrible flush faded from her cheeks. She slept deeply, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Ethan sagged forward, his head in his hands, relief flooding through him so powerfully it felt like drowning. Lydia's hand settled on his shoulder, warm and solid. She's going to be fine. Ethan looked up at her, and before he could think better of it, he reached out and pulled her into a clumsy, desperate embrace. Lydia stiffened for half a heartbeat, then relaxed, her arms coming up to circle his shoulders. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in the gray dawn light, neither of them speaking. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're a good father, Ethan Cole. Don't let anyone tell you different. Ethan couldn't find words, so he just nodded and turned back to Mara, watching her sleep with a fierceness that surprised him. He'd been so afraid of this, of caring too much, of letting someone matter enough to break him. But Mara had already broken him, cracked him open, and exposed every soft, vulnerable part he'd spent decades protecting. And somehow, impossibly, he was still standing. The storm cleared by midday, leaving the world buried in snow and sparkling under a pale winter sun. Lydia bundled up and made the trek back to town, promising to return the next day. Ethan watched her go, then went back inside to check on Mara. She was awake now, looking up at him with clear eyes, her fever completely gone. He picked her up, held her close, and felt something settle deep in his chest, a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. This was his family. Fragile, unconventional, held together by nothing but choice and stubborn hope. But it was his, and he'd fight heaven and earth to keep it. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting the snow and turning the high desert into something unexpectedly green. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, lupine and paintbrush, columbine and fireweed, splashing color across the drab landscape. The creek that ran past Ethan's property swelled with runoff, its voice loud and insistent after months of frozen silence. Mara, now nearly 6 months old, had grown sturdy and bright-eyed, her laughter a sound that filled the cabin with something Ethan had never known he needed. She could sit up on her own now, grab at things with determined little fists, and babble in a language all her own that seemed to contain every important truth about the world. But spring also brought the thing Ethan had been dreading, the county inspector. Sheriff Preston had warned them it was coming. The territorial court needed to verify that Mara was being properly cared for before they'd even consider granting Ethan guardianship, let alone adoption. A man named Horace Dalton would be making the rounds to all pending custody cases in the region, and Ethan's homestead was on the list. He's fair, the sheriff had said, but he's thorough. He'll want to see where the baby sleeps, what she eats, how she's developing, and he'll have questions, lots of them, about your income, your plans, your support system. Be honest with him, Cole. Don't try to make things look better than they are. Dalton can smell a lie from a mile away. So Ethan prepared. He repaired the cabin's worst flaws, patched the holes in the walls, replaced the broken window pane, scrubbed the floors until they were as clean as dirt floors could be. Lydia helped, bringing fresh linens for the cradle and a small collection of wooden toys she'd commissioned from the carpenter in town. Together they made the cabin look less like a bachelor's rough shelter and more like a place where a child could grow up safe. The morning Dalton was due to arrive, Ethan stood outside the cabin watching the trail, his stomach twisted into knots. Lydia stood beside him, Mara balanced on her hip, looking calm in a way that made him envious. Stop worrying, she said. We've done everything we can. What if it's not enough? Then we'll deal with it. She glanced at him, her expression softening. But I think you're underestimating how much you've accomplished here. This place, it's not fancy, but it's honest. And Mara's thriving. Anyone with eyes can see that. Ethan wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. He thought about what Brennan had said about how Mara deserved better than what he could offer. What if Dalton agreed? What if he took one look at the cabin and the hardscrabble land and decided a baby had no business being raised here? The sound of hoofbeats pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Two riders appeared on the trail, Sheriff Preston and a tall, angular man in a dark suit who sat his horse like someone who'd rather be anywhere else. They dismounted in front of the cabin and Preston made the introductions. Ethan Cole, this is Horace Dalton, Territorial Inspector for Child Welfare Cases. Dalton extended his hand. His grip was firm but perfunctory, his expression neutral to the point of being unreadable. He was maybe 50, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Cole, I appreciate you making time for this visit. Of course, Ethan said, though they both knew he had no choice in the matter. Dalton turned to Lydia, his gaze assessing. And you must be Miss Hart, the schoolteacher. I am, Lydia said evenly, meeting his eyes without flinching. I understand you've been assisting Mr. Cole with the child's care. That's correct. Dalton nodded, then looked at Mara, who was staring at him with the unblinking curiosity of a baby who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. May I? He asked, gesturing. Lydia hesitated for just a moment, then handed Mara over. Dalton held her with the careful competence of someone who had done this many times before, examining her face, her hands, the way she responded to his presence. Mara, to Ethan's relief, didn't cry. She just studied the inspector with serious eyes, one tiny fist tangled in his lapel. She's healthy, Dalton said, more to himself than to them. Well-fed, alert, no signs of neglect or mistreatment. He handed Mara back to Lydia and turned to Ethan. Shall we begin? The inspection lasted 3 hours. Dalton examined every inch of the cabin, took notes in a leather-bound journal, asked questions that ranged from practical to invasive. He wanted to know about Ethan's income, how much he made from selling firewood and occasional ranch work, whether he owned the land or was squatting on it. He wanted to see the food stores, the well, the sleeping arrangements. He asked about Ethan's past, his family, his reasons for wanting to keep Mara. And he asked about Lydia, how often she visited, what her role was, whether there were any plans to formalize the arrangement. That last question hung in the air like smoke. Miss Hart provides assistance as she's able, Ethan said carefully. She's been invaluable in helping me learn how to care for Mara. I see. And Dalton made another note. And you, Miss Hart, how would you characterize your involvement here? Lydia's chin lifted slightly. I care about Mara's welfare. Mr. Cole is doing his best to provide for her, but raising a child is difficult work, especially for someone with no prior experience. I've been helping to fill in the gaps. Out of charity or something else? The question was pointed, deliberately so. Ethan felt his jaw tighten, but Lydia's expression remained calm. Out of conviction, she said. I believe children should be raised by people who want them, not institutions that warehouse them. Mr. Cole wants Mara. That matters. Dalton studied her for a long moment, then returned his attention to his notes. The sheriff, who'd been quietly observing from the corner, finally spoke up. If I may, Mr. Dalton, I've known Ethan Cole for 3 years. He's a decent man, hardworking and honest. And I've seen how he is with that baby. He's not just going through the motions. He cares about her. I don't doubt his sincerity, Sheriff, Dalton said. But sincerity isn't sufficient. This child deserves stability, resources, a proper home environment. From what I've observed, Mr. Cole is providing the bare minimum. There's no school nearby, no other children for socialization, no female presence in the household on a permanent basis. If the child were a boy, perhaps these deficiencies could be overlooked. But a girl, she'll need guidance that a bachelor cowboy simply isn't equipped to provide. The words fell like stones. Ethan felt something cold and sick settle in his stomach. I'm doing everything I can. I'm sure you are, Dalton interrupted, not unkindly. But the question isn't whether you're trying, it's whether this environment is truly in the child's best interest. Lydia stepped forward, her voice sharp. And what environment would be better? An orphanage where she'll be one of dozens, where she'll receive care but no love. A wealthy family in Denver who will raise her like a charity case, always reminding her that she should be grateful for their generosity. Dalton's expression didn't change. Those are speculative concerns, Miss Hart. What I deal with are facts. And the fact is, Mr. Cole's situation is marginal at best. If he were married, if there were a woman in the home to provide maternal care, my recommendation might be different. But as it stands, he closed his journal with a definitive snap. I'll be filing my report with the territorial court within the week. They'll make the final determination, but I'm obligated to present my honest assessment. Which is? Ethan asked, though he already knew. Dalton looked at him, and for the first time, something like sympathy flickered in his eyes. That while your intentions are commendable, your circumstances are inadequate. I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. I truly am. After Dalton and the sheriff left, the cabin felt too small and too quiet. Lydia put Mara down for a nap, then joined Ethan outside where he stood staring at the mountains, his fists clenched at his sides. He's going to take her, Ethan said, his voice hollow. We don't know that yet. You heard him. Inadequate circumstances. He's already made up his mind. Lydia was silent for a moment, then said, There might be a way. Ethan turned to look at her. What do you mean? She met his gaze steadily. He said if you were married, his recommendation would be different, if there were a woman in the home. Understanding hit Ethan like a physical blow. Lydia, hear me out. She held up a hand. I'm not proposing anything romantic, but a marriage of convenience, a partnership, it would solve the problem. Dalton would have to acknowledge that Mara has a stable home with 2 parents. The court would be far more likely to approve the adoption. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Lydia's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing a business arrangement rather than the rest of her life. I care about Mara. I don't want to see her sent away any more than you do. And honestly, what do I have to lose? I'm 28 years old, unmarried, with no prospects, and no family who claims me. At least this way I'd be doing something meaningful. Ethan shook his head. You deserve better than a marriage in name only. Maybe, but I also deserve to make my own choices. She stepped closer, her expression intense. Listen to me. I've spent the last 6 months helping you raise that baby. I've fallen in love with her, Ethan. When I hold her, when I sing to her at night, when I watch her smile, I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do. And if marrying you is what it takes to keep her safe, then that's what I'll do. But what about you? What about the life you want? Lydia's smile was sad and wry. The life I wanted ended in Boston when I called off that engagement. Everything since then has just been improvisation. At least this way, I'd be improvising with purpose. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her eyes. She meant it. Every word. And the terrifying thing was, he could see it working. They'd already been functioning like a family for months. Making it legal would just be putting words to something that already existed, but it still felt like asking too much. What if you meet someone, he asked. Someone you actually want to marry? Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But right now, the only thing that matters is Mara, and I'm telling you, this is the solution. Ethan turned away, his mind racing. The practical part of him knew Lydia was right. A married couple stood a much better chance of keeping Mara than a single man living alone. But the other part, the part that remembered what it felt like to be used, to be valued only for what he could provide, recoiled from the idea of entering into a marriage without love. I won't trap you, he said finally. If we do this, it's with the understanding that you're free to leave whenever you want. No obligations beyond Mara. Agreed. And we tell her the truth when she's old enough to understand. I won't build our family on a lie. I wouldn't want you to. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to step off a cliff. All right, if you're sure, I'm sure. Then I guess we're getting married. The wedding took place 4 days later in the Silver Hollow courthouse, witnessed by Sheriff Preston and the town clerk. It was a brief, businesslike affair with no flowers, no music, no guests. Lydia wore her Sunday dress, and Ethan wore the only clean shirt he owned. Mara, oblivious to the significance of the occasion, dozed in Lydia's arms throughout the ceremony. When the clerk pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan and Lydia shook hands like two people closing a business deal. But that night, back at the cabin, the reality of what they'd done settled over them like a weight. Lydia stood in the middle of the room, still holding Mara, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. "I suppose this is home now," she said quietly. "I'll build you a proper bedroom," Ethan said, too quickly. "Give you some privacy. It'll take a few weeks, but that's not necessary." "It is." He couldn't look at her. "You gave up everything to do this. The least I can do is make sure you're comfortable." Lydia was quiet for a moment, then said, "Ethan, look at me." He did, reluctantly. "I didn't give up anything," she said. "I made a choice, and I don't regret it." She glanced down at Mara, her expression softening. "This little girl needs us. Both of us. And maybe we need her too." Ethan didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. Lydia handed Mara to him, their fingers brushing in the exchange, and went to hang up her coat. The touch lingered on his skin longer than it should have. That night, Ethan slept on his pallet by the stove while Lydia took the cot, Mara's cradle between them like a bridge. He lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of Lydia's breathing, the small noises Mara made in her sleep, and wondered what he'd gotten them all into. The following week, Ethan rode into town to file the marriage certificate with the county clerk and to send word to Horace Dalton that his circumstances had changed. He expected some kind of immediate response, a letter, maybe, or another visit. But days passed with no word. The waiting was torture. He threw himself into work, building the promised bedroom addition onto the cabin, cutting and hauling logs until his hands bled and his back screamed. Lydia helped when she could, holding boards steady while he hammered, mixing mortar for the chinking, never complaining about the sawdust that coated everything. They were working together one afternoon, Ethan up on the roof framing out the walls while Lydia handed up supplies, when Mara started crying from her basket in the shade. Lydia climbed down immediately, scooping the baby up and soothing her with practiced ease. Ethan watched from above, saw the way Lydia's face transformed when she held Mara, all the hard edges softening into something tender and unguarded, and felt a strange tightness in his chest. She looked up and caught him staring. "What?" "Nothing," he said quickly, returning to his work. But it wasn't nothing. It was the realization that Lydia wasn't just helping him anymore. She was building something too. A life, a purpose, a place to belong. And somehow, without either of them planning it, they'd become partners in more than just name. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset with Mara playing on a blanket between them, Lydia broke the comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "After the adoption is finalized, after Mara's officially ours. What then?" Ethan considered the question. "I suppose we just keep going. Raise her, make sure she has what she needs. And us? Do we just keep going too? Living like business partners who happen to share a roof?" The question made him uncomfortable. "I thought that was the arrangement." "It was. It is." Lydia pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "But I've been thinking, we're building a family here, a real family. And families need more than just practical cooperation. They need connection, trust, maybe even—" She stopped, shook her head. "Never mind." "Maybe even what?" "Nothing. It's foolish." Ethan turned to look at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair, at the vulnerability in her expression that she tried so hard to hide. "Tell me." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze on the mountains. "Maybe even love," she said finally, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "Not the romantic kind necessarily, but the kind that comes from choosing each other every day, from building something together that matters." Ethan felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking apart beneath the surface of a frozen river. He'd spent so long protecting himself, keeping everyone at arm's length, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. But Lydia had already gotten past his defenses without him noticing, had made herself essential in ways that had nothing to do with Mara and everything to do with who she was, brave and honest and stubbornly hopeful, even when life gave her every reason not to be. "I think maybe it's already there," he said, surprising himself with the admission. I just didn't know what to call it. Lydia looked at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the sunset. Really? Really? He reached out, hesitated, then took her hand. Her fingers were rough and calloused from work, warm and solid in his grip. I'm not good with words, Lydia. And I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. But I know that when you're here, everything feels less impossible. And when you're not, he stopped, struggling. When you're not, the cabin feels empty, even when Mara's in it. Lydia squeezed his hand, her throat working. That's how I feel about you too. They sat there as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the stars began to emerge, hands linked, Mara babbling contentedly between them. It wasn't a declaration of undying love or a romantic revelation. It was quieter than that, more honest. It was two people who'd been alone for too long admitting that maybe they didn't have to be alone anymore. 3 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived from the territorial court. Ethan's hand shook as he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. Lydia stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, her grip tight enough to hurt. He read it once, then again, not quite believing what he was seeing. Well? Lydia asked, her voice strained. Ethan looked up at her, a smile breaking across his face. The first real smile she'd ever seen from him. They approved it. The adoption. Mara's ours. Lydia's breath left her in a rush. She grabbed the letter from him, scanning it herself as if she needed to see the words with her own eyes to believe them. They approved it, she repeated, wonder in her voice. Ethan, they approved it. And then, without thinking, without planning, Ethan pulled her into his arms and held her tight. Lydia melted against him, her face pressed against his shoulder, and he felt her shoulders shake with silent sobs. He held her through it, one hand tangled in her hair, the other pressed against her back, and understood that she was crying for all of it, for the fear they'd carried, for the relief flooding through them now, for the family they'd fought so hard to keep. When they finally pulled apart, both of them laughing and wiping at their eyes, Mara was watching them from her basket with a confused expression that said very clearly she had no idea what the fuss was about. Ethan picked her up, holding her high above his head until she squealed with delight. You hear that, little one? He said, his voice thick. You're ours. Really and truly ours. Nobody's taking you away. Lydia wrapped her arms around both of them, and they stood there in the morning sunlight, a cowboy, a schoolteacher, and the baby they'd chosen, feeling like maybe, just maybe, they'd earned the right to be called a family. The summer that followed felt like stepping into a life Ethan had never dared to imagine for himself. The bedroom addition was finished by early June, giving Lydia her own space with a real window that looked out toward the mountains and a door she could close when she needed solitude. But more often than not, that door stayed open, and the three of them moved through the expanded cabin like water finding its natural course. Easy, inevitable, right. Mara was crawling now, getting into everything with the single-minded determination of someone discovering that the world was full of fascinating dangers. Ethan found himself baby-proofing the cabin in ways he'd never anticipated, moving tools out of reach, banking the fire more carefully, watching where he stepped because his daughter had a habit of appearing underfoot at the most unexpected moments. His daughter. The words still felt strange in his mouth, too big and too precious, like something he might break if he spoke them too loudly. But Lydia used them without hesitation, and gradually Ethan learned to do the same. This is your daughter. Our daughter. She's ours now. The legal paper sat in a wooden box on the mantel, proof that what they'd built together was real and recognized by law. But Ethan knew the truth went deeper than any document. Family wasn't made by courts and signatures. It was made in the middle of the night when Mara had a fever, and they took turns walking her until dawn. It was made in the moments when Lydia laughed at something silly Mara did, and Ethan felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. It was made every morning when they woke up and chose each other again, chose this life they were building one day at a time, but the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. One afternoon in late July, Ethan was working in the garden they'd planted, rows of beans and squash and potatoes that Lydia had insisted they needed if they were going to feed 3 people through another winter, when he heard a rider approaching. He straightened, shading his eyes against the sun, and felt his stomach drop when he recognized the horse. It was the same bay gelding Samuel Brennan had been riding the last time he'd come to deliver his unwanted opinions. Brennan dismounted with his usual stiff arrogance, surveying the improvements to the property with an expression that suggested he found them inadequate. The new bedroom, the vegetable garden, the chicken coop Ethan had built in the spring, none of it impressed the man who measured worth in acres owned and cattle branded. "Cole," Brennan said, not bothering with pleasantries, "heard you went and married the school teacher." "News travels," Ethan replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Does indeed." Brennan spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Also heard the court approved your adoption petition. Congratulations." There was no warmth in the word, no genuine goodwill. Ethan's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Brennan?" "Want to make you an offer. A good one, considering." Brennan pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "I'm buying up land in this valley, consolidating properties. Yours sits right in the middle of what I'm putting together. I'll give you fair market value, more than fair, actually. Enough for you and your new wife to relocate somewhere more suitable for raising a child, maybe closer to town where she'd have neighbors, other children to play with. This land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Cole. It's just a matter of price." Brennan unfolded the paper, revealing a bank draft with a number that made Ethan's breath catch. It was more money than he'd seen in his entire life, more than he'd earned in a decade of breaking his back on this hard-scrabble piece of ground. But it wasn't about the money, and they both knew it. "I said no," Ethan repeated, his voice hardening. "This is our home. We're not leaving." Brennan's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake. This land barely supports one person, let alone 3. You think you're doing right by that baby, but you're just being stubborn. My offer stands for 1 week. After that, I'll be acquiring the adjacent properties, and you'll find yourself surrounded by my holdings. Might get uncomfortable, being the only holdout in the middle of my range." The threat was barely veiled. Ethan took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Get off my property!" For a moment, tension crackled between them, sharp as lightning before a storm. Then Brennan smiled, cold and humorless, and remounted his horse. "1 week, Cole. Think about what's best for your family, not just your pride." He rode off, leaving Ethan standing in the garden with fury and unease warring in his chest. The encounter left a bitter taste, the kind that lingered long after the immediate cause was gone. He tried to push it aside, to focus on the work that needed doing, but his hands were shaking and his thoughts kept circling back to that bank draft, to the casual cruelty of Brennan's implication that staying here meant failing his family. Lydia found him an hour later, still standing in the garden, though he'd accomplished nothing since Brennan left. She had Mara on her hip, the baby's face smeared with mashed berries, and one look at Ethan's expression told her something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, setting Mara down on a blanket in the shade. Ethan told her, the words coming out rough and bitter. When he finished, Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze on the mountains. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally. "Tell him to go to hell." "All right, then that's what we'll do." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You don't want to at least talk about it? That's more money than we'd see in—" "I don't care about the money," Lydia interrupted, her voice firm. "This place, it's ours. We've built something here, a home, a life. You don't just walk away from that because some bully with too much land and not enough sense decides he wants what you have." "But what if he's right? What if I'm being selfish, keeping us here when we could afford something better?" Lydia crossed to him, took his face in her hands, and forced him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. Better isn't about money or size or how close we are to town. Better is about where we're loved, where we belong. And we belong here, all 3 of us." The certainty in her voice steadied something in Ethan that had been threatening to come loose. He covered her hands with his own, holding them against his face, drawing strength from her touch. "What did I do to deserve you?" he asked, the question barely a whisper. "You stopped," Lydia said simply. "When everyone else would have kept riding, you stopped. And you keep stopping. Every day you choose to be here, to stay, to fight for this family. That's what you did." Mara chose that moment to let out an indignant squawk, demanding attention, and they both laughed, the tension breaking like a fever. Lydia picked up their daughter, who immediately grabbed for her mother's hair with sticky, berry-stained fingers, and Ethan watched them together, feeling something fierce and protective swell in his chest. Let Brennan come. Let him threaten and posture and wave his money around. This family wasn't for sale, but Brennan, it turned out, wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Over the next week, small problems started appearing. Ethan's fence line was cut in 3 places, forcing him to spend a full day riding the property to mend the gaps before his neighbor's cattle wandered through. Someone left his gate open, and it took him hours to round up the few horses he kept. Tools went missing from his shed: a good axe, a coil of rope, a pair of wire cutters. Nothing catastrophic, nothing he could prove was deliberate, but the pattern was clear enough. Someone wanted to make his life difficult. The final straw came when he rode out to check on the spring that fed his well and found it contaminated, the water cloudy with what looked like deliberately dumped refuse. It would take days to clean out the spring and wait for fresh water to flow through. In the meantime, they'd have to haul water from the creek, adding hours of labor to already long days. Ethan stood looking at the ruined spring, rage and helplessness warring inside him. This was Brennan's work. He was certain of it. But proving it would be impossible, and even if he could, what would it accomplish? Men like Brennan always found ways to make problems disappear, to shift blame, to emerge unscathed while their victims suffered the consequences. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after Lydia and Mara had gone to bed, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold and contemplating options he didn't have. The bank draft was still out there, still available if he swallowed his pride and accepted defeat. They could take Brennan's money, buy a small place in town, give Mara the stable, comfortable life she deserved. It would be the practical choice, the smart choice. But it would also mean letting Brennan win. It would mean teaching Mara that bullies got their way if they pushed hard enough. It would mean abandoning the first place that had ever felt like home. Lydia's voice startled him from his dark thoughts. "You're going to wear a hole in that table, staring at it like that." He looked up. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom, wrapped in a quilt, her hair loose around her shoulders. Even exhausted and worried, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength and stubbornness and the fierce love she carried for their family. "Can't sleep," he admitted. "Neither can I." She crossed to the table, sat down across from him. "Talk to me." So he did. He told her about the vandalism, about the ruined spring, about the certainty that Brennan was behind it all, and the frustration of not being able to prove it or stop it. He told her about the bank draft that still haunted him, about the temptation to just take the money and walk away from this fight. Lydia listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her own cup of coffee, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Do you remember what you told me the night we decided to get married?" she asked finally. "You said you wouldn't build our family on a lie, that we'd tell Mara the truth when she was old enough." "I remember." "What truth are we going to tell her if we let Brennan run us off our own land? That we gave up because someone made things difficult? That we chose the easy path over the right one?" Ethan felt something shift in his chest, like a key turning in a lock. "You think we should stay?" "I think we should fight." Lydia's eyes were fierce. "Not with fists or guns. I'm not talking about violence. But there are other ways to fight. Legal ways, community ways. Brennan's powerful, but he's not invincible. And he's made enemies in this valley. I hear things at the school, parents talking. Other small ranchers who felt his pressure, homesteaders who resent the way he's been gobbling up land. If we stand up to him, we might not stand alone." "That's a risk?" "Living is a risk. Loving is a risk. Building a family on a piece of hard ground at the edge of nowhere is a risk." She reached across the table, took his hand. "But we've already taken all those risks. What's one more?" Ethan looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit between his like they were made for it, and felt something loosen in his chest, the fear and doubt he'd been carrying for days, maybe longer. Lydia was right. They'd built this family on bravery and stubborn hope. Giving up now would betray everything they'd fought for. "All right," he said, "we fight." Lydia smiled, fierce and proud. "Good. Now come to bed. We're going to need our strength." The next morning, they rode into Silver Hollow together, Mara secured in a sling across Lydia's chest. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where they filed formal complaints about the vandalism, providing dates and details of everything that had happened. Sheriff Preston listened with a grave expression, taking notes, promising to investigate, though they all knew how difficult proving anything would be. "I can't move against Brennan without evidence," Preston said, "but I can let him know I'm watching. Sometimes that's enough to make a man think twice." Their second stop was the general store, where the owner, a shrewd woman named Martha Hayes, who'd been running the business since her husband died, listened to their story and offered surprising support. "Brennan's been squeezing folks out for years," Martha said, her voice low. "Most people are too scared to push back, but if you're willing to stand up to him, you might be surprised how many folks will stand with you." She was right. Over the next few days, as word spread about what was happening, people started appearing at the homestead. The blacksmith came out to help Ethan clean the spring, refusing payment. A rancher named Tom Hensley, whose land bordered Ethan's on the east, offered to ride fence with him, adding extra eyes to watch for sabotage. Even the minister's wife, a formidable woman named Grace Sullivan, showed up with a casserole and a stern determination to help organize what she called community resistance. "Brennan thinks he can intimidate good people into selling," Grace said, settling herself at Lydia's kitchen table like she planned to stay. "Well, he's about to learn that this valley isn't as easy to control as he thought." Within a week, a loose coalition had formed. Small ranchers, homesteaders, townspeople who were tired of watching Brennan's empire expand at everyone else's expense. They started meeting at the schoolhouse after hours, planning strategies, sharing information, building the kind of solidarity that came from shared struggle. Lydia became the de facto organizer, her teacher's instincts for managing unruly groups serving her well. Ethan found himself at the center of something larger than his own fight, representing not just his family, but everyone who'd ever been told they weren't big enough, strong enough, important enough to matter. The confrontation came on a sweltering August afternoon. Brennan rode onto Ethan's property with 4 of his ranch hands, clearly intending to intimidate through numbers. But Ethan wasn't alone this time. Tom Hensley was there, and the blacksmith, and half a dozen other men who'd decided that enough was enough. Brennan pulled up short when he saw them, his expression darkening. "This is private property, gentlemen. You're trespassing." "Actually, Sam, they're my guests," Ethan said, stepping forward. "And you're the one trespassing. I told you my land wasn't for sale. That hasn't changed?" "Your land?" Brennan's laugh was ugly. "You don't own this land, Cole. You're squatting on it. I checked the county records. The previous owner died without heirs, and the property reverted to territorial control. All you've got is a claim that isn't worth the paper it's written on." The words hit like a punch. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, felt everything they'd built start to crumble. He'd always assumed the land was his through homestead rights, but if Brennan was telling the truth— "That claim is being contested," a new voice interrupted, and everyone turned to see a man in a dark suit dismounting from a buggy that had just pulled up. He was elderly, with white hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "My name is Albert Simmons, and I'm an attorney out of Denver. I've been retained by Miss Hart, Mrs. Cole, I should say, to review the property records for this land. And I can assure you, Mr. Brennan, that Mr. Cole's homestead claim is perfectly legitimate and properly filed." Brennan's face went red. "That's a lie. I had my own lawyers check." "Then I suggest you hire better lawyers," Simmons said calmly, pulling documents from his satchel. "The previous owner did die intestate, but before that happened, he sold the land to a man named William Graves. Mr. Graves subsequently sold it to Mr. Cole 3 years ago. The deed is properly recorded. I have certified copies right here." Ethan stared at the lawyer, then at Lydia, who stood on the porch with Mara in her arms and a small, satisfied smile on her face. She'd done this. Somehow she'd found a lawyer, dug through county records, built a legal defense he hadn't even known they needed. Brennan snatched the documents from Simmons's hands, his eyes scanning the pages with increasing fury. When he looked up, his expression was murderous. "This isn't over, Cole." "Yes, it is," Ethan said quietly. "You tried to run us off, and you failed. Go home, Brennan. Find someone else to bully." For a moment, the air crackled with the possibility of violence. Then Brennan spat into the dirt, wheeled his horse around, and rode off without another word, his men following. The assembled homesteaders and townspeople erupted in cheers, clapping Ethan on the back, shaking Simmons' hand, celebrating a victory that felt bigger than just one man keeping his land. But Ethan barely heard them. He crossed to the porch where Lydia stood, took her face in his hands, and kissed her, really kissed her, for the first time since their courthouse wedding. She made a small sound of surprise that then melted into him, one arm wrapping around his neck, while the other held Mara safe between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Lydia was laughing. "What was that for?" "For being brilliant, for saving our home, for being exactly who you are." "We saved it together," she corrected, but her eyes were bright with tears. Ethan looked down at Mara, who was staring up at them with wide, curious eyes, then back at Lydia. "I love you," he said, the words coming out raw and honest. "Not because we're married or because you helped me keep Mara. I love you because you're brave and stubborn and you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. I love you because when I'm with you, I'm better than I ever thought I could be." Lydia's breath caught. "Ethan, you don't have to say it back," he continued quickly. "I know this wasn't what we agreed to. I know we were supposed to be partners, not—" "I love you too," Lydia interrupted, her voice shaking. "I've loved you for months. Maybe since that first night when you brought Mara to the schoolhouse and looked at her like she was the most important thing in the world. I didn't know if you—" He kissed her again, softer this time, silencing her doubts with the answer his words couldn't quite capture. Around them, people were still celebrating, still talking about the victory they'd won, but Ethan and Lydia stood in the center of it all, holding each other and their daughter, and felt the world narrow to just the three of them. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Mara was asleep in her cradle, Ethan and Lydia sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge. She was tucked against his side, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. It felt natural, inevitable, like something they'd been moving toward since the moment they met. "I hired that lawyer with the money I'd been saving for a new dress," Lydia said quietly. "It took almost everything I had." Ethan tightened his arm around her. "I'll buy you 100 dresses." "I don't need 100 dresses. I just needed to keep our home." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Do you think Brennan will try again?" "Maybe. But if he does, we'll handle it. Together." "Together," Lydia echoed, and Ethan heard the promise in that word, not just for this fight, but for all the ones to come. For the hard winters and failed crops, for the illnesses and injuries and setbacks that were inevitable in a life like theirs. For the moments of joy, too, the small triumphs that would sustain them through the difficulties. Somewhere inside the cabin, Mara stirred and made a small, sleepy sound. Ethan felt Lydia smile against his chest, felt her hand find his and squeeze. And sitting there under the vast Colorado sky, surrounded by land they'd fought to keep and love they'd fought to earn, Ethan finally understood what it meant to have a family. Not the one you were born into or the one that was chosen for you, but the one you built with your own hands from hope and stubbornness and the kind of love that refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier. They'd started with nothing, an abandoned baby, a marriage of convenience, a piece of hard ground at the edge of nowhere. But they'd built something real from those raw materials, something worth fighting for, something that might last. The year that followed their victory over Brennan brought changes that reshaped not just their homestead, but the entire valley. Word spread about how the small ranchers and homesteaders had stood together, and that solidarity became something more permanent, a cooperative of sorts, where families shared equipment, helped with harvests, and looked out for each other's interests. Ethan found himself unexpectedly thrust into a leadership role, the man who'd started the resistance becoming the one others turned to when problems arose. It was uncomfortable at first, being visible in that way, but Lydia stood beside him at every meeting, her teacher's clarity cutting through arguments and finding common ground, and gradually he learned to trust that he had something worth contributing. Their cabin continued to expand. Ethan built a larger kitchen, then a small parlor, then a loft bedroom for Mara that looked out over the valley. Each addition was made with materials bought or bartered from their neighbors, each nail driven with the knowledge that they were building something meant to last. The homestead stopped feeling like a bachelor's rough shelter and became what it had always wanted to be. A family home, lived in and loved, full of the particular kind of chaos that came from raising a child who'd discovered walking and had opinions about everything. Mara, at 18 months, was a force of nature. She had Lydia's determination and Ethan's stubbornness, a combination that meant bedtime was a nightly negotiation and mealtimes often ended with more food on the floor than in her mouth. But she was bright and curious, babbling in a mixture of real words and invented language, following Ethan around the property like a devoted shadow whenever he'd let her. She'd learned to say Papa first, then Mama. And the sound of those words never stopped making Ethan's throat tight with gratitude for the life he'd somehow stumbled into. But as Mara grew and thrived, a different kind of tension began building between Ethan and Lydia. Not the bad kind born of conflict, but the uncertain kind that came from two people who'd started as partners of convenience and found themselves tangled in something deeper than either had planned for. They shared a home and a daughter, shared work and worry, and small moments of joy, but they still maintained separate bedrooms, still moved around each other with a careful politeness that felt increasingly absurd given everything else they shared. It was Lydia who finally addressed it, one evening in late autumn, when Mara had finally exhausted herself into sleep, and they sat together by the fire, mending clothes. The domestic quiet of it, the two of them working side by side, comfortable in their silence, made what she said next feel both natural and terrifying. "We should talk about our marriage," she said, not looking up from the socks she was darning. Ethan's hands stilled on the shirt he'd been patching. "All right. When we married, it was for practical reasons, to keep Mara, to satisfy the court." Lydia set down her needle, finally meeting his eyes. "But things have changed. We've changed. And I think we need to decide what we're doing, whether this is still just a practical arrangement or if it's something more." Ethan's heart was suddenly loud in his ears. "What do you want it to be?" "I asked you first." He set aside his mending, buying time to find words for feelings he'd spent months trying not to examine too closely. "I told you I loved you. That hasn't changed. If anything, it's gotten worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. But I don't want to push you into something you're not ready for. We made an agreement, and I meant what I said about you being free to leave if—" "Ethan," Lydia's voice was gentle but firm. "I don't want to leave. I've never wanted to leave. I'm asking because I'm tired of dancing around this. We're married. We love each other. We're raising a daughter together. But we're still living like polite strangers who happen to share a roof, and it's driving me mad." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want a real marriage. Not in name only, but in every way that matters. I want to be your wife, not just Mara's mother or your partner in keeping this homestead running." She paused, vulnerability flickering across her face. "If that's what you want too." Ethan crossed to where she sat, knelt in front of her chair, and took her hands in his. They were rough from work, capable hands that had helped build everything good in his life, and he held them like they were precious. "I've wanted that since the day we stood up to Brennan together," he said quietly. "Maybe even before that. But I was afraid. Afraid you'd feel trapped. Afraid I'd be asking too much. Afraid I'd ruin what we already had by wanting more." Lydia's eyes were bright with tears. "You're not asking too much, and you couldn't ruin this if you tried." She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his. "I choose you, Ethan Cole. Not because of Mara, not because of this land, but because of who you are. Because you're good and honest and brave in ways that have nothing to do with fighting or standing up to bullies. Because when I'm with you, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He kissed her then, deep and slow, pouring everything he couldn't say into that connection. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lydia was smiling through her tears. "So," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "should we move your things into my room or mine into yours?" Ethan laughed, the sound startled out of him by the practicality of the question. "Yours is bigger, and it has the better view." "Then it's settled." She stood, pulling him up with her. "Come on, let's not waste any more time pretending we're something we're not." That night marked a turning point. The moment when their marriage stopped being something they were doing for Mara's sake and became something they were doing for themselves. The physical intimacy came naturally, built on months of emotional intimacy and genuine love, and Ethan finally understood what it meant to be completely known by another person, seen in all his flaws and fears and still chosen, still wanted. The winter that followed was hard, as Colorado winters always were, but it felt different knowing they were facing it together without reservations or careful distance. They moved through the cold months as a unit, Ethan breaking ice on the water trough while Lydia kept the cabin warm, taking turns with Mara when she was fussy or sick, stealing moments of connection whenever they could. And when spring came again, bringing mud and wildflowers and the exhausting work of planting, they did that together too. But as Mara's second birthday approached, a shadow from the past returned in an unexpected form. It was Sheriff Preston who brought the news, riding out to their homestead on a gray April morning with an expression that told Ethan something was wrong before the lawman even dismounted. "Got something you need to know about," Preston said, accepting the coffee Lydia offered but not drinking it. "Had a woman come into my office yesterday. Says she's Mara's mother." The words fell like stones. Lydia's hand found Ethan's automatically, gripping tight, and he felt the floor shift beneath him. "That's not possible," Lydia said, her voice strained. "Mara was abandoned. Whoever left her gave up any claim." "Legally, you're right," Preston interrupted gently. "The adoption's final, and this woman's got no legal standing to challenge it. But she's asking to meet with you, says she has things she needs to explain, things you deserve to know." "What's her name?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. "Sarah Brennan." The surname hit like a physical blow. Ethan felt rage and understanding crash over him in equal measure. Brennan's daughter. Granddaughter, actually. Sam Brennan's son, Marcus, had a daughter out of wedlock, then married someone else and tried to pretend Sarah didn't exist. When she got pregnant herself without being married, the family wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. Told her to get rid of the problem or get out. Lydia's face had gone pale, so she left Mara on the tracks. She says she was desperate, thought someone would find the baby, give her a better life than an unwed mother with no family and no money could provide. She didn't know about the train schedule. She was trying to make sure Mara would be found, not killed. Preston shifted uncomfortably. "She's been working as a seamstress in Denver this whole time, trying to build a life for herself. Says she thinks about Mara every day, wonders if she made the right choice. When she heard about the adoption going through, about a family named Cole raising a baby girl they'd found on the railroad tracks, she put the pieces together." "What does she want?" Ethan asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "To meet her daughter, just once. To see that she's all right, that she ended up with people who love her." Preston looked between them. "You don't have to agree to this. Like I said, legally she's got no claim. But I thought you deserved to know she exists, to make the choice for yourselves." After Preston left, Ethan and Lydia sat in silence, Mara playing contentedly with wooden blocks at their feet, oblivious to the storm building around her. The little girl they'd raised, who called them Mama and Papa, who was theirs in every way that mattered. Suddenly there was someone else in the equation, someone who had a biological claim, even if the law said otherwise. "We don't have to do this," Lydia said finally, her voice tight. "We could say no, protect our family from what? The truth?" Ethan scrubbed his hands over his face. "I spent my whole childhood wondering why my mother died, why I had no father, why nobody wanted me. Every kid in that orphan train had the same questions eating at them. What if we could give Mara answers instead of wondering? And what if those answers hurt her? What if knowing she was abandoned, she already knows she was abandoned. We've never lied to her about how we found her." Ethan watched Mara stack blocks with intense concentration. "But maybe there's a difference between knowing you were left and knowing why. Maybe there's something in understanding that your birth mother was desperate, not cruel, that she thought she was doing the right thing." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll meet with her, but we set the terms. This is about giving Mara information when she's old enough to understand, not about letting this woman back into her life." "Agreed." They arranged to meet Sarah Brennan in town, at the schoolhouse on a Saturday when classes weren't in session. Neutral ground, public enough to feel safe, but private enough for a difficult conversation. Ethan and Lydia arrived early, Mara between them holding both their hands, and waited with a tension that made every minute feel like an hour. When Sarah finally arrived, Ethan understood immediately why she'd made the choice she had. She was young, maybe 22, with dark hair and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone her age. She was thin to the point of frailty. her clothes clean but worn, her hands nervous as she stood in the doorway looking at the daughter she'd left to die. Mara, curious and fearless, stared back at the stranger without recognition or fear. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, tears already streaming down her face. "I knew she would be, but seeing her—" Her voice broke. Lydia's hand tightened on Ethan's, and he could feel her fighting every maternal instinct that said to grab Mara and run. But they'd agreed to this, and so they stood their ground. "Come in," Lydia said, her voice carefully neutral. "Sit down. We have questions." Over the next hour, Sarah told them her story, about being raised by grandparents who saw her as a shameful secret, about the man who'd gotten her pregnant and disappeared when she told him, about the ultimatum her grandfather Samuel Brennan had given her, get rid of the baby or be cast out with nothing. She tried to find a way to keep Mara, had spent weeks looking for work that would let her care for an infant, but every door had closed in her face. Unmarried mothers weren't welcome in respectable boarding houses, weren't hired for decent jobs, weren't offered help by churches that preached mercy but practiced judgment. "I thought if I left her where someone good would find her, she'd have a chance," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I watched from the trees until you stopped, until I saw you pick her up. And then I ran because I knew if I stayed, if I let myself look at her one more time, I'd never be able to let her go." "You left a note," Ethan said, his voice hard. "It said, 'Unwanted.'" "I know." Sarah's face crumpled. "That was my grandfather's word, the thing he called both of us when he threw me out. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it would make someone angry enough to prove him wrong, that it would explain why I had to leave her." She looked at Mara, who'd grown bored with the adult conversation and was exploring the schoolhouse. "There's no excuse for what I did. I gave up the most important thing in my life because I was scared and desperate and stupid. But I want you to know, I want Mara to know, someday, that I didn't leave her because I didn't love her. I left her because I loved her too much to watch her starve." The raw honesty of it broke something open in Ethan's chest. He thought about his own mother, about the choices poverty and desperation forced on people, about how easy it was to judge someone when you'd never faced their particular hell. He thought about the note, about how that single word had haunted him, and realized that maybe it had been meant as a challenge rather than a statement of fact. Lydia was crying silently, still holding Ethan's hand, still watching Mara with fierce protectiveness. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Really?" "Nothing," Sarah said immediately. "I don't want to take her back, don't want to disrupt her life. I can see she's loved, that you've given her everything I couldn't. I needed to see her, to know she was all right. And I hoped maybe, when she's older, you might tell her that I didn't abandon her because she wasn't wanted, that I thought about her every single day, that giving her up broke something in me that will never heal." "We'll tell her," Ethan said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "When she's old enough to understand, we'll tell her everything, about how we found her, about you, about the choices you had to make. She deserves the whole truth." Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you. Thank you. But understand this," Lydia added, her voice gentle but firm. "We're her parents. We're the ones who've been there for every fever, every nightmare, every small triumph. Whatever biological connection you have to her, we're her family. That's not going to change." "I know. I wouldn't want it to." Sarah stood smoothing her worn skirt with trembling hands. "I should go. Would it be all right if I—" "You can say goodbye to her," Ethan said quietly. "Just this once." Sarah crossed to where Mara was examining a chalkboard, knelt down to the little girl's level. Mara looked at her with curious eyes, and Sarah smiled through her tears. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Sarah." She reached out, hesitated, then gently touched Mara's dark hair. "You're going to have a wonderful life. Your mama and papa love you so much. Be good for them, all right?" Mara, who didn't understand the significance of the moment but recognized kindness when she saw it, smiled and offered Sarah one of her wooden blocks. Sarah took it with shaking hands, held it for a moment like it was something precious, then handed it back. "Goodbye, Mara." She stood and walked to the door without looking back, and Ethan and Lydia let her go. After she was gone, they stood together in the schoolhouse with Mara between them, processing what had just happened. "Are we doing the right thing?" Lydia asked quietly. "Letting her go without—" "Yes," Ethan said firmly. "She's not a threat to us. She's just a woman who made an impossible choice and has to live with it. We can afford to give her that closure." Lydia nodded, then picked up Mara and held her close. "Let's go home." That evening, after Mara was asleep, Ethan and Lydia sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire and gold. The meeting with Sarah had shaken them both, forcing them to confront the reality that their family had been built on someone else's loss. But it had also crystallized something important. Mara was theirs not because of blood or biology, but because they'd chosen her every single day since the moment Ethan had pulled her from those tracks. "When do we tell her?" Lydia asked. "About Sarah? About how we really found her?" "When she starts asking questions. When she's old enough to understand that families come in all shapes, that love isn't about blood." Ethan pulled Lydia closer against his side. "We'll tell her the truth. All of it. The good parts and the hard parts. And we'll make sure she knows that being chosen is just as important as being born into something." "Do you think she'll understand?" "I think she'll have us to help her understand. And that'll be enough." The years that followed proved him right. They told Mara her story gradually, in age-appropriate pieces, never making a secret of her origins, but also never making them the defining fact of her existence. She learned that she'd been found on railroad tracks, that she'd been given a second chance by people who loved her. When she was older, they told her about Sarah, about impossible choices and desperate love, about how sometimes the bravest thing a parent could do was let go. Mara processed it all with the resilience of a child who'd never doubted she was loved. She asked questions, cried some tears, but never once suggested that Ethan and Lydia weren't her real parents. They were the ones who'd been there, after all. The ones who'd fought to keep her, who'd built a home and a life around her presence. Biology was just a fact. Family was something you built. By the time Mara turned 5, the homestead had transformed completely. The small cabin had grown into a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The land produced enough to support them and trade with neighbors, and Ethan had become known throughout the valley as someone you could trust, someone who'd stand up for what was right, even when it cost him. Lydia had turned one room of their house into a small school, teaching not just Mara but several other children from neighboring homesteads, giving them the education frontier life often denied. And Mara grew into a bright, confident child who knew she was loved without reservation, who'd been taught that worth wasn't about where you came from, but about who you chose to be. She had her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength, and she navigated the world with the fearlessness of someone who'd never been given a reason to doubt her place in it. One spring morning, when Mara was 6, Ethan took her to the place where he'd found her. The railroad tracks were still there, unchanged, the iron rails gleaming in the early light. Mara stood looking at them with serious eyes, holding her father's hand. "This is where my story started," she said, not a question, but a statement. "One of the places," Ethan agreed. "Your story started lots of places. In a woman's desperate love, in a split-second decision to stop, in your mama's choice to help, in all the moments between then and now." Mara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "Papa, I'm glad you stopped." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Me too, sweetheart, me too. Can we go home now? Mama said she'd teach me to make biscuits today." Ethan laughed, the sound carrying across the high desert. "Yeah, let's go home." They walked back to where Lydia was waiting with the wagon, and as they climbed up and headed back toward the homestead, Ethan looked at his wife and daughter and felt something settle deep in his chest. This was family. Not the one he'd been born into or the one he'd imagined in the desperate loneliness of his youth, but the one he'd built with his own hands from choice and courage and stubborn love. They'd started with a baby abandoned on railroad tracks, with a marriage of convenience, with nothing but hope and determination. But they'd built something real from those raw materials. They'd built a home where everyone belonged, where love wasn't conditional on blood or circumstance, where the word unwanted had been transformed into its opposite, chosen, claimed, cherished. And as the wagon rolled toward home, toward the life they'd fought so hard to build and keep, Ethan understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic moment or a single grand gesture, but the quiet accumulation of days lived honestly, of promises kept, of love given freely and received with gratitude. They were family. The word had once felt impossible, something other people had that he could only watch from a distance. But now it was his, messy and imperfect and absolutely real. And he'd spend the rest of his life being worthy of it, being the father Mara deserved and the husband Lydia had chosen, building a legacy not of land or wealth, but of love that refused to quit even when the world said it was impossible. The sun climbed higher as they drove, warming the Colorado morning, and Mara started singing, some nonsense song she'd made up about chickens and horses and biscuits. Lydia joined in, her voice harmonizing with their daughters. And after a moment, Ethan did too. Their voices carried across the valley, three people singing together, heading home.